Who gets to tell the story of the U.S. military? And then who pays the price when those stories are filtered, sanitized, or ignored? And who are telling the stories specifically of the military families and the spouses? Oftentimes we see military news about the troops, about the sacrifices, about the weapons, about the hardware, but we don't often understand truly the stories of the military families. And someone who has made a huge contribution in that effort is Navy spouse and journalist researcher Jennifer Barnhill. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you a little bit more.
I'm excited to chat with you. We've known each other now, I think, for a couple years. We met at the
Yep.
Military Influencer Conference, not last year when I was there very
Yeah.
briefly, but the year before. And it was a wonderful opportunity to actually sit down and have coffee with you and get to know you. And then we've just kind of kept in touch ever since. You interviewed me for a story about military influencers.
Yeah.
And I follow you on social media and a lot of the posts. And then when you wrote the book that we're going to talk about today, I knew at some point I was A, going to read the book, and then B, I was hoping you would come on the podcast. And you did. Here you are.
Yay.
So, welcome to the Stories of Service podcast, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. I'm the host of Stories of Service. And to get this podcast started, as we always do, an introduction from my father, another broadcaster, Charlie Pickard.
From the moment we're born and lock eyes with our parents, we are inspiring others. By showing up as a vessel of service, we not only help others, we help ourselves. Welcome to S.O.S, Stories of Service, hosted by Teresa Carpenter, here from ordinary people from all walks of life who have transformed their communities by performing extraordinary work.
And Jennifer is a journalist, researcher, and one of the most influential advocates for military families today. She is the host of Military Dinner Table Conversations, a reverse town hall that captures what military families are actually saying when the cameras are off and the uniforms are hung up. Those conversations, she argues, are the shaping the future of recruitment and retention more than any marketing campaign ever could. And today we're going to talk about those unseen forces behind the all volunteer military families. Her path into this work was anything but planned. She walked away from a fully funded PhD scholarship after falling in love with a Navy service member. Like many military spouses, yes, she did not realize she was just marrying she did not realize at the time she was just marrying a person. She was marrying into this institution. And at first she fell in love with the military community, and then there was somewhat of a shock. Military families take care of each other, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes the institution itself has made life harder and not easier. But rather than turning away, Jennifer leaned in. She received her master's in public administration at UNC Chapel Hill. And armed with the knowledge from this education, she returned to journalism with those sharper teeth and has exposed many, many stories about food insecurity among military families, bureaucratic battles surviving spouses, the widow tax, and many, many other stories that we'll get into today. And all of this culminated in her debut book, The Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear. So how are you doing today, Jennifer?
It's always weird hearing your bio. I don't know. I don't know that I will ever feel comfortable with it. I'm doing great, though. I'm excited to talk about military families. And I know we've chatted a little bit offline about it, and I'm really excited to get started. Here we go.
Well, I'm excited, and I really didn't even read everything in your bio. I had to kind of skim through some of this stuff, but I know how you feel. It's so weird. I've had my bio read before too, and I've had other guests tell me the same thing. It's very strange to hear someone talk about yourself while you're sitting right there. So I totally understand, but it's well deserved. You've done so much amazing work. I mean, even the beginning of your book where you talked about the day that you met with President Bush and you told him about the work of your father. I think that's a good place for us to start and sort of your military journey. I know that you married into a naval officer, but tell us a little bit about just that day. I think that's a nice way to kick off this show as well.
Yeah. So the book opens with an interaction that I had with someone that I participated in a program with that gave us the opportunity to have dinner with President George W. Bush. And the program is the Stand To Veteran Leadership Project. And the reason I was there was because of my journalism and my work, telling the stories of military families. But in that moment, you have a once in a lifetime opportunity to speak to a president. It's, I was so nervous. I'm a writer. I'm not
Right.
like a public speaker. And I was listening to others because we were at the same dinner table, right? We were in this very personal moment. And there were folks who were seamlessly talking about their work that they were doing, what brought them to the table. And I had a personal connection to him that, went back to one Tuesday morning, many years ago now, September 11th. My dad was in Tower 1. I believe it's called the North Tower, but I always just called it Tower 1 because it was just like where dad worked, right?
Yeah.
And so I had this opportunity to talk to a president. And it was really hard for me because I didn't know which story to tell. As a journalist, we talk about, we learn for so many stories to the point where, sometimes I recognize people, I don't recognize their faces, but I remember like the detail of their story. I don't know if you've had that happen with a podcast.
I have.
Yeah.
I have.
It's like, about their personal life, but you maybe forget their face.
Right. Right. Or you start to put like pieces together with different people's stories that form a cohesive narrative about an issue. I'm sure you've done the same thing.
Yes. And so it was really hard and challenging to kind of pick which one. And in the moment, I, went with my gut, and I told my father's story of how he, survived the impact of the first plane, but, moved down a few flights, to make a phone call and reach out to family. But in the interim, in the chaos of that day, we didn't get the phone call that he had actually left. Cell phones were flip phones at the time,
Sure.
all of those things. And I was, in college, I think it was my first or second year of college, and I didn't have any idea. I went to a 9 a.m. class, had no idea what happened. And so eventually, obviously, he did make it out. He came back and we were just so happy that he did. But it was President Bush's message and the narratives he kind of put out in the world that was kind of one of the first moments where I was like conscious of the role of the military in our national safety. It was very personal to me because I obviously felt very vulnerable. Our family, had been directly impacted by these events. And so it was a personal connection to a nationwide global event that I took that moment to talk with him about something personal because, at the end of the day, all of the stories that we receive, they're all personal to someone. They're not just headlines. They're not just, data points. So the book really kind of digs in and tries to humanize and personalize these narratives that we hear. And it's kind of similar to that experience with President Bush, where I could have, pitched my idea, but realistically, I don't know that, he would have nodded his head and said, okay, that's nice. But making connection is all what this whole storytelling thing is about. And so that was really a choice that I made, and I was proud of it in the reflecting back. But it really does speak to the purpose of the book as well, which is to kind of bring people together and have better understanding of lived experiences.
Absolutely. And this is a community that you not only studied from a journalistic standpoint, but this is a community that you lived and that you knew from your experience. And when you first came into this community, you were on the career track. You were going to go and get a PhD. You had this whole other path planned. And then, life slaps you in the face. What is it, like Mike Tyson that says, good plan is only as good as the first punch in the face, or he says something along those lines. And I think that's kind of what happened with you, is that your life takes this other turn, but then you turn into a journalist that's now covering military families. How did you get started in doing that? And what was that like for you at first?
Yeah. So, kind of going back to like becoming a military spouse, I met my husband when I was working at the Smithsonian, and I wanted to pursue a PhD in art history, and I wanted to like go live in Italy and like eat pasta and drink wine. Like, who doesn't want to do that, right?
Right.
But I also knew that realistically, that is a really competitive field too. And I had both journalism in the background. That was my undergrad, and then I was going to write about the art history part. So it was a pivot, but it seemed like, well, best laid plans, right? Like, it's hard to get a job in this field. It's a very niche topic, right? So
Sure.
it felt like it wasn't this big compromise at the time. But it was something that, you think something, you knew what you're getting into is like a phrase you obviously hear. I'm sure as a service member yourself, like I'm sure people said something like that. You knew what you signed up for, right?
Oh, totally. All the time people say that.
Yeah,
of course.
And the same messages are shared with families as well. So like you knew what you're getting yourself into. And I would say, like, I'm not suggesting that service members know more, because I think it's everyone to some spectrum has this experience where they thought that they knew. For me, it was, what do you mean you can't like put in for leave and know that you're going to get it approved, right? Like I didn't understand that about the military culture because I didn't have exposure to the military. And so it was very much like no is not a real answer kind of person where, it's not no, it's what does it take to get to yes, kind of my brain works that way. And so it was very hard, hitting into the wall with the military, but eventually, I came to really love it. And so we lived in Japan early in our marriage, made some amazing friends. I was really lucky and I was able to work for MWR in their communications team. And so I was able to like do radio work, which is crazy, and do the captain's call. I don't know if that's something that is around still, but the local television for the AFN, and
okay.
I wrote for Stars and Stripes, and I say little like clips for AFN from MWR. So it wasn't like a show or anything.
Sure.
But I got to keep going with the journalism, and I wrote for Stars and Stripes, doing like local restaurant things. So, I had that thread, but it took one experience with a friend who had a pretty devastating diagnosis to kind of like, hit that wall again. I came to find out that families were kind of expected to come around her and anyone in that circumstance to support with food, with meal trains, childcare, just be there. And everyone in our community, we stepped up as much as we possibly could to support that family. But we all had full-time jobs. We had children of our own. It was a different environment than what maybe existed in previous generations where maybe not both the spouse might not have worked. And so that structure of support that was relied upon to be there for families, it's all volunteer. And so in our modern day, it just wasn't playing out as I know was intended. So I kind of dug in on that, and I pulled on that thread. And that was kind of the first article or theme that I really wanted to understand. And that ended up becoming chapter 3 of the book. So that's kind of how I got started. And then it's just one story leads to another. And you learn more and more, the more threads you pull on.
Sure. And I think that a lot of times people don't understand that as a military spouse, especially people in the civilian sector, I think those of us who serve understand it, but people in the civilian sector don't understand that there's so much lost wages and lost ability to recertify. I mean, I think I just read recently that there's even problems now with all the different licensing programs where they were supposed to recognize certain professions from state to state, and that's not going as well as some may have hoped. And those are real issues when it comes to military families, because in this day and age, 2-parent working homes are the norm a lot of times, and military families are statistically underemployed. And especially as you get into the junior ranks, that can have severe consequences where military families face food insecurity issues. I was exposed to that through a classmate of mine at the University of San Francisco that I go to school with. And she's really done a great job of educating us and myself and other classmates about this issue with having to have food pantries, for an example, for military families. And that was something that, me as a junior enlisted single person, I never really gave a lot of thought to, but it's a real problem with our families sometimes not getting that support that they need.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. And I think that, you kind of mentioned that it's hard for people to understand. That kind of is some of these issues, right? Are that there are solutions. You referenced an article, that came out recently. I believe it was from Military Times that talked about how DoD put out a letter, or the department put out a letter saying that, this is not being followed, and we really take this seriously. This law, this provision that does exist. The reason, it's heartening to hear that they come out and say that. Sometimes I've seen, and over the years, many years, a lot of times you see a lot of memos or even policies that are intended to help a family situation, but there's not a lot in the way of follow-up in the enforcement side because, to be fair, jurisdictions are limited. They don't have direct oversight over the bodies that issue licenses, for example. They don't. And so it's this weird, we are a weird group of people who find ourselves all over the country, all over the world. But the problem is that it causes harm, to our careers, to our financial security as individuals who, we don't have the opportunity to vest into even if we do work, we don't always get our vested return, right? Because we move every 2 to 3 years with our service members. Things have changed over the years with, remote opportunities, things like that. But the DoD, it's such a habit, is so tied to service members because that is their mission. We are not their mission, but if we're not considered in the calculation, the mission isn't going to be as successful. And so I think that there is, it's an important aspect of the military community is to focus on the families. And I do think that has had various levels of success over the years. There's always more and room for improvement for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the things that surprised me too was how much of what military spouses do on the day-to-day is volunteer, unpaid work, and how you might not be forced to do it, and you might not, which I loved. You did this whole history about back in the day, it was part of maybe a military member's promotion, or there was tied to a certain amount of requirement from the spouse. But this day and age, it's not required, but it is expected, especially if you are the spouse of a commander, let's say. You're the spouse of the commanding officer. It's expected as the spouse that you're going to play some kind of a role, whether you want to or not. And then, like you said, there really aren't sometimes those support services that are available. Or like you said, sometimes there'll be policies that come out that there won't be that enforcement side or that lack of follow-up. And that's what I think I really appreciated about your book is that you don't just say this, you back it up with evidence in case after case after case. I mean, you talked about the issue with the burn pits, for an example. And, that was more service members, but you talked about Red Hill. You talked about the cases with, I think it was a military exception, a cancer wife, a wife who's, and just all these kinds of cases where the services and the support that was supposed to be there was not there.
Yeah. And I think that, individually, I think we have had, I have, and I'm sure you have too, amazing experiences with caseworkers, with administrators who go above and beyond in their job. But it's a case by case situation sometimes because the structure doesn't always support them, to be honest.
No,
and the story that I think you're referencing in the book is the chapter that is focused on resilience. There was a mother of 2 children who had unrelated cancer diagnoses who went to receive assistance from their military treatment facility. And when she was working with because when you have 2 kids with cancer, you're at the hospital all the time. And so she was working with someone who was supposed to help determine if she was eligible for a caseworker. And ultimately, she was told no, that she wasn't eligible for a caseworker. And she confronted this person who she had built a relationship with because of the frequency of visits. And, when someone's going through that, you reach out, you bring them together. And she was a caring worker, but she's like, why wasn't I qualified? And she's like, if I came in disheveled, like lipstick on my teeth, in sweats with food on my clothes, would you have said yes? Would you have given me approval to have a case manager? And she's like, to be honest with you, yes, we would have. And it was almost this idea that because she was displaying outward resiliency, that she did not need the service. And it really highlights that idea that, if we can be shiny on the outside, then we must be fine on the inside. We must not need help because we've gotten this far on our own.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the real unfortunate parts that is often overlooked when it comes to the families is they're expected to, and military members as well, we're expected to just push through. And oftentimes we absolutely do need that support, and not just from the individual who's doing it, who might not be getting support to do it, but the policies that back that up. And I think that your courage in writing a book like this, did you worry as you wrote it that you were questioning some of the same things that, here's my husband, he works for the military, but at the same time, I want to be able to advocate for the things that I'm seeing within my military family. Did you ever feel conflicted about that?
I mean, I always came at it with real stories from real people, and I contextualized those singular experiences with the available data. And so I didn't worry because I do believe that our services understand that they're not perfect. And I think that sometimes the context that they're in, they don't always structurally have the ability to make everything better. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. They need congressional funding or approval to do something or to change something. An example in the book, where that might be the case would be mold in housing, unsafe living conditions where families, and I'm not going to, there's many different circumstances of unsafe living conditions. And in the book, I referenced Red Hill, and I think that that's slightly different. But just say the average duty station, if there's mold in housing before the Tenant Bill of Rights, which is something that's available now, where families can go and ask for, kind of push back against the privatized housing companies. Before that existed, they would go to their housing offices. They might elevate it to the base leadership. But if the base leadership doesn't have the money to repair it, they cannot cancel these forever contracts that are in existence. They're government contracts. They can't get rid of them on their own. So they're prohibited from, advocating to Congress. They can consult, but they can't go knocking on the door in that direct way. And so it's almost this reliance upon the people who are boots on the ground experiencing this hardship to elevate their own problems outside of the chain of command, because it isn't structured in a way that enables, and for many good reasons, but the negative side of that is that families have to step up, and service members themselves, veterans, have to stand up and say, this isn't working. We've seen that with veterans care, at the VA a long while back. And so people obviously probably knew that the caseload was a mess before it became a mess publicly. But,
that's I think the big thesis of your book, though. The big thesis of your book is let's try to attack these problems when they first appear. Let's not let them carry on. And I think your touchstone story that I mentioned before the call of letting a problem carry on, and this is obviously not controversial anymore, but it's the story of all the wives who didn't have any information and didn't know when their husbands were going to come home from war during the Vietnam War. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to remember the chapter numbers. One of the chapters looks at So the book is kind of it intersperses some historical accounts with some modern stories that haven't, they're modern history. And one of the historical stories looks at the spouses of the POWs during Vietnam. They were held prisoner in the Hanoi Hilton and other, prison camps after they were shot down. And looking at specifically an organization called the League of Wives. It was founded by Sybil Stockdale, who was married to the highest ranking officer in the Hanoi Hilton, Admiral Stockdale. And, it kind of came about accidentally, their organization and their effort. It centered around a dining table in Coronado, California, of similarly impacted family members just not knowing what to do. They knew some of them didn't know if their service members were alive. Some did. They received letters. But, ultimately they were not hearing much progress wasn't happening. They didn't hear from the Navy or from, anyone else that something was going to be done to provide, a safe return. And so they met together and they were brainstorming and they were trying to work within the system as best they could. But ultimately they found out through coded messages that they passed back and forth that their spouses were being tortured. And that was not something that was public knowledge at the time. So everyone knew that, the war was unpopular, but it would have been even more unpopular had that come out. And so at least that was the perception at the time. And so, these military spouses were really torn because they knew things that were happening that violated the Geneva Convention. And they also saw that nothing was being done about it. And so it was, kind of a proud powder keg, right? Like they were part of this, what I would call almost like a spy. They're kind of spies because they passed coded messages. They had to decide to participate, right? Because they were writing letters and that's how they communicated with the POWs. And so their story is kind of one that's a little hidden, but and now we might look at it, like I said earlier before, with like this feminist lens of like, those, they were doing the work and they were being, advocates, and they really just wanted to get their spouses home. And they took charge and they were organized and they did all the things that we might come to see a modern, spouse doing, but they did it out of necessity because they were just confronted with the worst case scenario of knowing their husbands were being tortured and no one was helping them. And so they're like, okay, let's do it. They decided eventually when nothing was happening, they're like, we're going to go to the media because we are not going to sit back and let this happen. When someone you love, they're hurting and possibly dying across the world. Spouses are just, we have the similar values that our partners do. And I get a little teary thinking of it, but we care about this country. We care about the service. And so these women stepped up and they did their service, and they served not only their families, but they served the country by elevating the true story of what was going on. And they really were instrumental in returning their husband safely to our country and to getting it publicized that there were violations of the Geneva Convention. And in that, when they did that, their husbands reported getting better treatment. So there was a direct connection that their husbands made to the efforts of this group to their treatment. And so it's an untold story that I didn't even know as a Navy spouse for many years. And I'm just so proud to have learned more about it.
Right. And it culminated in a few years back with a dedication of a memorial in Coronado of those spouses. And it's a really beautiful dedication and statue. And I didn't know anything about this story either until I read it in your book. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the attention of so many people. And I think something that probably a lot of spouses struggle with, and obviously us in the military struggle with, is when do we take a story to the media? And what would you advise a spouse who is struggling with something, isn't getting heard through Congress, isn't getting heard through their service members' chain of command, but is worried about blowback or retaliation? How would you advise them?
So, I'm probably the worst person because if people, I always say, let me know. But I also would not encourage, I wouldn't encourage anyone to just reach out to the national media, on, one issue pops up, right? It's not always appropriate because it might not be the level of the solution. So what is the level of the solution to your problem? That's usually what I think of is, have you attempted? Did you try calling the housing office? Like, yeah, like, have you exhausted the available resources, and have you documented what's going on enough to be able to show someone outside of the problem what's going on? So that could be Congress, that could be media. You need to be able to share what it is and be able to articulate that. So usually you understand the problem once you've kind of gone through the system to a level where you learn it a little more than you ever wanted to, right?
Right.
I know way too many things about like the, dispute resolution processes for like tenant bill of rights. And I know about like retirement with medical disability. Like I know too much about some of these administrative processes, but you kind of have to know a little bit about where the system broke. And that means you have to understand it a little bit. So I would never encourage someone not to speak out ever. I just would encourage them to find the appropriate level of where you should reach out based on your circumstance.
I agree. And I think sometimes there's just some problems that are just systemic that you have to use media or use podcasters like me, like the problems within our administrative system that you so skillfully documented yourself and did a story with Krista, a person I had on my show as well, about some of the failures within the IG system. And those are systemic issues that to this day still haven't been fixed. Or there's issues within the UCMJ that don't give people the same due process protections as the people in the civilian side. Those are, I think, systemic issues that we've got to keep talking, in my opinion, that we have to keep talking about in the media, whether that be veterans talking about it, whether that be active duty, or whether that be spouses, because those are the kinds of changes that there hasn't been a fix yet. But to your point, I do believe that much of the advocacy that has been done around burn pits, for an example, that's obvious. There was legislation passed. There was more protections put in place due to the years and years. But then you also bring up the fact that there was a point very much early on where they could have fixed the problem before it became the problem that it did. Which brings me to another question. Have you seen instances that aren't in the book where the military has fixed a problem or solved a dispute before it had to go to a media report, or you did a query and then the military was aware of the issue and said, yeah, we're on it, we're fixing it?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple. One is there's an office that actually your guest, Jeremy Hilton, had formerly worked for, the Defense State Liaison Office. They're constantly working it, but I think it's really hard because the way that these systems work, they're very slow and we move through them quick, right? In the grand scheme of things, the fixing policy, especially at their level where they were working with different states to change policies that impacted families, it's not a fast process, but it's like my pastor says, like, things happen slowly and suddenly at this same time. It's like what has been building, then all of a sudden it's changed and it's better. Another example of a positive is I've seen a lot of installation commanding officers holding town halls and being willing to engage with people. So when it's similar to, there's another member of the book, Zumwalt, who did retention study groups where he solicited feedback from people. When our leaders are asking for feedback from the community before there's a problem and while there's a problem, and they're not afraid of the questions that they're going to be asked, it's a vulnerability, but it's also a trust. It builds trust with the community. And I found that people who are participating in those things are less likely to go and complain on Facebook if they know they're going to be heard.
That's such a great point, Jennifer. Such a great point. I mean, I can go back to any of my workplaces where I felt comfortable going to my boss. Therefore, my boss dealt with less complaints from everyone because he was available and he was open to helping resolve problems. So I would agree that that's common sense as you go through your organization, any organization, that is key to solving some of these issues. How did you decide which stories to put in the book?
Oh, it's I think the stories that like would keep me up. I think those are the ones that kind of made me, because there's ones that I forgot. Like I wish that I mentioned the fact that, this is the overarching active duty experience, but this is something you might like. Over here is National Guard, and over here is Coast Guard, and they have similar challenges but different challenges. I couldn't write about Coast Guard because that's a whole nother department that I am not like an expert in writing about, and so I didn't dig in deep. But I think that the stories that ended up in there were the ones that just, they weren't told a lot. They were themes that make people uncomfortable, to be honest,
Right.
but are
Yeah.
required. But it's the things that when you pull the thread, what's at the end of the spool? What's at the end? Some of these things are the things that I found, not the end, but towards the end, right? It's the systems of support and how we fix problems in the community. That's the underlying issue. Like if we're not doing program evaluation, then we rely upon families to have a problem, which makes us look bad in the media, which makes service look bad. Why are we doing it this way? So it's just, I care about the military enough to call out its nonsense, right? And so that's how I chose some of these things, is that if we want it to be better for the next generation, we have to look at our own circumstances and what we are in right now and examine, how can we fix this? How can we address this? And that's not to simplify because it's complex, but there are some things as far as messaging is concerned that could go a long way, kind of to the point of the town halls. There's a lot of, just people will say things, but let's see the action behind them. Like we always want to see what is, I say, put your money where your memo is, or,
Sure.
let's hear about it, but let's see the action, right? So
Absolutely.
that's how I chose it, is what bothered me the most.
Yeah, what keeps you up at night? And we do have somebody who's
Yeah.
joining us on the call, and Corinder, I had a good question that I thought I would bring, because you did say something about medical and disability. So this isn't really about the families, but I know that you've done some issues about this, and I thought this was a good question, so I'll say it on the show. What aspects of your military experience do you feel are misunderstood by civilians when disability is involved when it comes to the military?
So there are two areas that I have researched in this. One, and so I can't speak to and I want to make sure I also understand the question. So I'm going to take it for what I think it means, which is looking at, those who want to join the service and also those who are currently serving. When I dug into learning more about, the reason I did that, to rewind a little bit more, is I wanted to understand how military children of actively serving personnel who were enrolled in their military's exceptional family member program, what would happen, because the medical records are kept, what would happen when they go to serve themselves? Because we know many military children end up serving as well. And so I wanted to understand that. And so I started doing research to understand what's a disqualifying condition? What is a disqualifying condition for those who are being recruited, and what is a disqualifying condition for people who are currently serving? I don't know if you've had the opportunity to talk to Greg. I think Martin is his last name, but he wrote a book called
Bipolar General.
Bipolar General. And so I had previously interviewed him before I started that line of inquiry, and it was clear that people serve with distinction, with many diagnoses or undiagnosed, right? So it was
many
striking
conditions.
And so it was very surprising to me, as someone who did not necessarily have the knowledge yet up until that point, that there were differences between the disqualifiers for those seeking to join and those who are currently serving. They're different, and that was I didn't understand that was possible. I understand why it's practical, but theoretically, a person who goes to a recruiting station could be turned away for the same diagnosis that a person who is serving actually has. And it didn't seem right. And I wanted to understand a little bit more. And I don't know if that is addressing the question, but there is a lot when it comes to disability that is not necessarily talked about often. And I dig into that a little bit in the book, specifically with Tori Ridgway's story, which is what started this kind of research. I don't know if that answers. Do you think there's another aspect that
I think that the person
address?
who asked the question was also asking, which I cover too on my podcast, which is he says, how does acquiring a disability change your sense of identity as a service member or veteran? And that this kind of goes into a deeper question about how the military defines the word disability. What does that mean? And who gets to decide what is a disqualifying diagnosis and what isn't? And Jennifer, I can only speak from personal experience on this issue because I received a disqualifying diagnosis when I was 19 and almost was med boarded out of the military. And that's at least on the mental health side. I learned what I feel and what I still believe to be a very subjective nature to them, at least on the mental health side, to some of these diagnostic criteria, where one person can say you have an adjustment disorder and another person can say you have PTSD, and it all just sort of depends on which doctor you see. And so this isn't, especially issues of the mind and sometimes even issues in the body. This is a science, but it's also a doctor and it's a doctor's opinion. So I think the biggest thing that's misunderstood is that I think sometimes people think this is a hard science. And I'm here to say that I don't think or feel that it is. And if it was, then we wouldn't be having this rating schedule that's coming up. I don't know if you've been following that issue with the VA disability, where they're going to change some of the ratings schedules because they want to lower some of the diagnostic criteria scales. But the overall point is that these are hard discussions, and these are things that people really don't want to talk about. But these are stories that are happening every day to our veterans and are happening every day to our service members, and then the families are feeling the hurt of that as well.
Yeah, and while most of the time I don't cover active duty topics, how I entered this conversation was because of a military family member wanting to join, and I think that it highlighted for me the variability in the process. Each recruiter has influence over the process, and they might not. I've heard from sources that there are individuals who will tell you, nope, you're not going to get in with that condition, and then that's enough verbally, even though it's not a documented denial. It's a turning away because the paperwork will be so cumbersome, and then only to get denied. This is what sources have shared, is that it's just not worth the heavy lift for the recruiters to go through the process. Whereas in a recruiting station that maybe it has lower numbers, some of those recruiters will refer that person to a different location. And to me, that is giving deference to the military, because there is a law that civilian employers have to follow, which is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it talks about discrimination on the basis of disability. And there's there's a deference paid to the military, but with the presumption that there is a repeatable process. And the article, that's consistent. And I'm not saying that it's not nuanced, right? Like, we want people to serve, and we want them to be safe. We don't want them to put themselves or someone else in harm's way. So there is absolutely an appropriate, it's appropriate to look at physical and mental health, but it should be a somewhat repeatable process, or at least a process that's more transparent than I had found it to be in my research. And that's it's included both, I think, a little bit in Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. It kind of goes into some of those details, but the question is very well, asked. There's a lot to this topic for sure.
There's a lot to it. And I think it's a topic of much discussion, and will continue to be. We'll continue to wrestle with it. I just don't think that, especially as it pertains to something that you can't easily test or something that you can't easily see, it's just going to be a hard issue that the military is going to have to do the best they can to grapple with. But what we really need on the ground and with our eyes and our ears is that we need to tell these stories, and we need people to be willing to share them and talk about them openly. And I really applaud you for taking the time that you did to write the book. How long did it take you to do it?
I mean, writing it was probably a 2-year process. The research that led into it, I went from civilian, I'm not in the military, and I had to learn things that are internal to the military from scratch, essentially. So it's basically been a 7-year learning process, getting my master's in the process, and, kind of collecting my own data where there weren't any, surveying spouses, doing qualitative research on specific topics like volunteerism, because some of this stuff, data exists, but it's not about us, right? Like, so I think of like the DoD does survey spouses, but in 2021, they surveyed us about COVID, and our vaccination status. And I don't want to go into too much of that, but the thing that was interesting was the findings came out 2 years later. It wasn't really about how, like, what is a problem that we could have acted on at that time? Like,
Sure.
When you're not going to get the data for years, it's like, well, why did you want that? That was the underlying my question. It's great. I'm glad you got information and wonderful, but it's like, why? We need to be asking the right questions that really get out fixing the problems that we're facing. And so sometimes, the research took a long time, and sometimes it didn't exist. And so I had to collect it myself.
Right.
But it's been a while. It's been a long process for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think what you did was like I said, an outstanding contribution to the history of the military. There really does not exist much history regarding military families or military spouses. I thought some of the best research that you did in the book was towards the beginning when you talked about, and you just did, I think, is kind of a cursory study of military stories in the media. And you did like a percentage, and you'll probably be able to describe it than I can, but you did a percentage of stories that were about families and about spouses versus about military members. And I get it. Like, there's probably, obviously, we're the military. We're going to do majority of our stories about the military, but I think it was something like 6% or some very low number of stories that you found that were about family issues or about the families.
Yeah, it was 6 out of about 140 something, 147, 6 of them. And it was like one of them that was coded. I basically read all military. So Stars and Stripes, military.com, military times,
all the major trades, Task and Purpose, all those major.
And I coded them. And one of those stories was like about a benefit related to the CDC, the Child Development Center. So like, it wasn't about us. It was just related to a family topic. So like, it wasn't great. And another finding that was really interesting that I think that your audience would be interested in was the fact that officers were quoted 9-1, and that is hardly representative. And I know we've connected on this before, with your previous role of like, we understand why. Often, the PAO might be an officer and they're speaking on behalf of, but it means that the stories that we're reading really are not coming from the mouths of the people experiencing whatever it is that we're talking about. And because of the policies that restrict speech. And that's, one of the first things that we ever connected on was looking at military influencers and what is okay, what is appropriate. How do you navigate the Wild West of being, publicly, talking about the military. And so having a voice,
it's very hard because of our limited free speech protections. And when I say the word limited, I mean subjective. I mean, it all depends on who you work for, how they view what you're doing on social media. It's up to commanders' discretion to decide how much or how little you're allowed to post or you're allowed to have a presence. I've known influencers that were told to shut down and investigated, ultimately cleared. But I mean, the process, I always say the process is the punishment. So it is very difficult as an active duty member. Now, it's not as difficult if they just want to do feel good news stories or if they want to have a leadership podcast or something. That is not, because the guys that do the podcast, and it's a wonderful podcast, actually, Permission to Speak Freely, and they do sometimes tackle hard issues, but I don't necessarily think they're poking the bear, and they do it, and I think there's some merit to that. There's definitely a way that you can advocate as an active duty member, even, but you just have to do it very, very carefully. And you have to be aware that there are going to be people that aren't going to like what you're doing, and they're going to look for those holes, or they're going to look for some sort of a vulnerability that you have. And you have to be very careful. And I think that sometimes even the military spouses, they have to be very careful, because whatever they're advocating for could maybe reflect poorly on their husbands. And so it does make it difficult. But the thing that I am grateful for is that we are not told not to speak. And so, I had an active duty presence as a serving member, active duty social media presence. And so I know there are some people who can do it and do it well, but it is very, very difficult.
Yeah. And it goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, where if leadership is not opening up the doors and being vulnerable and soliciting feedback, and if the only way you get your feedback or hear about these maybe controversial topics is through an influencer who maybe some of them maybe have more of a plugged into the leadership knowledge than others, but if you're only hearing from them, then you're not getting necessarily the best information. So it really kind of points back to opening, lines of communication and being more transparent. I think that that's something that over the history of the military there's been various levels and policies that some people are more transparent, some people are not. Administrations change and things change, but I think that as individuals, like, we have to be able to have these hard conversations with each other, because if we don't, then we're just gonna doom the people coming after us to kind of deal with the same problems again and again and again. And I know it's not always at everyone's responsibility to fix all these problems, but I think it's disingenuous to not have hard conversations, right? Like, we can't just talk about how much we love it and just sweep everything under the rug. At least that's just not my personality anyway.
No, it's not mine either, obviously. What is the biggest takeaway as we're winding down the call? What is the biggest takeaway that you want people to walk away from after reading the book? Or what would you like for them to do or say, or how you want them to feel?
Well, I hope that they walk away with a little bit more information of what the military spouse experience, military family experience is. But I also would encourage them to tell their stories, to be honest, because there's always more to the story. There's stuff that's not in this book that maybe should be. There's probably 7 more books, not by me, because I'm not ready for that. But there's just a lot. And in order for us to kind of look at the narratives of the things that we're talking about the military, if the military members, veterans, are not actually saying what they experienced and sharing what they experienced, then all the civilian population will know is what they're told, and or what they read in a headline, and it's very the same, or it's just not that nuanced experience. And I think that we need that nuance in our communities. We don't want to just hear the same thing from the same places again and again and again, because it's easy to kind of believe what you're told when you don't have an insight from a person that or a friend, or it's just easy to kind of just take the news and say, oh, yep, that's probably true of the military, or and I just think that there's always more to the story. So I would just encourage people to tell their story.
I mean, stories are messy, and people are messy, and the institutions are messy. And I think sometimes sadly, like we were talking, through messaging, like earlier, about headlines, people just see a headline, and it as polarized as it can be, they just jump to an emotional reaction, and it's usually something political, and it's not the full story. It never is. And I think that if you can try to dig a little bit further and dig beneath a story, what you'll find underneath is just real humans struggling to get by any way they can and figure out life. And we're all in it together, Democrat, Republican, whatever. We're all in it together. And I think the more we can see that, I think the better off we'll be, regardless of what your personal beliefs are on a particular issue. So
Yeah.
I thank you so much, Jennifer. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about the book or about your work before we get off the call?
No, I mean, I just appreciate the opportunity to share. And, anytime I can get an opportunity to tell people about these stories with, a population that really just doesn't get the platform to talk always. And, you might know, if you're a service member, you might know your spouse's experience, but, there is a bigger experience that all of us kind of have these like parallel journeys, even though we're very different, every spouse is different, but there are a lot of similarities, and those similarities can sometimes, help bring us together and help us feel connected, to know that my being pissed off because my husband didn't get leave is probably not unique to me. It's out there. And so if you're a service member listening, maybe you share this with your partner, that they would, have, feel a little bit more seen in their experience. That would be my only thing to share.
I love it. I love it. And just as a reminder, please tell the audience the name of your book and where they can find it.
Yeah. And I actually even have it. I'll even show you.
Wonderful.
The
Here, let me put you on full screen.
Oh, yeah. There you go. The military stories you've been told and the ones you need to hear. I don't know if it's reversed in the screen, but
nope, it's not.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So military stories you've been told and the ones you need to hear.
Awesome. Awesome. And that is on Amazon. You can get it there, or you can also download it like I did on your Kindle. But it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It's so well researched and sourced. And of course, you're a journalist, so you're a great writer. But that not naturally, not always, I guess. But you're a very, very good writer. And I just love your book. I mean, honestly, I think there was a few times I would read a story and I'd be like, oh man, like we didn't even talk about like the widow tax. That was another one that just really just broke my heart, that people, and I don't know if that's still going on, where military spouses who get remarried sadly lose the benefits that they deserve for losing their spouse. So there are certainly a lot of stories in the book that deserve to be read and talked about. And I just thank you so much for everything that you did to bring awareness on this issue. And I will meet you backstage to say goodbye as I say goodbye to the audience.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right, guys, that is a wrap. Next week, I believe I have 2 more shows, and then I'm going to take 2 weeks off and take a little bit of a break. But I hope you enjoyed this broadcast tonight. Stay tuned. I'll have the other promos out within the next couple days. But as I always end these calls, please take care of yourselves. Please take care of each other and enjoy the rest of your evening.